Hi, everyone, and welcome again to the San Francisco office to another Talks at Google event. We're very pleased to welcome George Packer here today to talk about his new book, The Unwinding. And George is currently a staff writer and has been for The New Yorker since 2003. He's covered the Iraq War for the magazine and has also written about the atrocities committed in Sierra Leone, civil unrest in the Ivory Coast, the megacity of Lagos, and global counterinsurgency. His book, The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, was named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times and won the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Book Award and an Overseas Press Club Book Award. He's authored several nonfiction books and 2 novels, contributed numerous articles, essays, and reviews on foreign affairs, American politics, and literature to the New York Times Magazine, Dissent, Mother Jones, Harper's, and other publications. He's taught writing at Harvard, Bennington, and Columbia, and he currently lives in Brooklyn and New York. But this is a homecoming of sorts because he grew up in Palo Alto. So welcome back to the left coast. Please welcome George Packer to Google.
Thank you, Nick. It is wonderful to be at Google. There was no Google when I was growing up here. Google has changed everything, and it's great always to come back and see what's happening here. It always feels like if I get depressed in other parts of the country and come back to the Bay Area and sit out on the bay with my macchiato, nothing could possibly be wrong anywhere in the world. And this is where you live and work. So lucky you. I'm going to talk a bit about The Unwinding and inner history of the New America and read a bit from it, and then I'd love to answer questions about it. But the book began in a way back in Iraq, which I covered for The New Yorker. And as Iraq imploded in the early years of the war, I went from seeing it as a failure of leadership. We know their names. People in Washington, generals, politicians, people in the media, to seeing it more as an institutional failure as well. You couldn't just pin it on this or that person. It seemed like whole American institutions were put to this stress test in Iraq. Like we tried to do something really hard, harder than we'd done in a very long time, and it turned out the body politic was in really bad shape. From government to media, the military, intelligence, and I began to wonder, how did this happen? Has it been happening for a long time? Why has it happened? That we were able to rebuild post-war Europe, and we weren't able to bring electricity to Baghdad to the level it had been at before the war. And then I came home from Iraq and covered the 2008 presidential election, and suddenly institutions were collapsing all around us. Wall Street was collapsing. General Motors. It seemed as if all the pillars of American life, one after another, were eroding or absolutely falling to pieces. And that was the beginning of my thinking about The Unwinding. I decided that I wanted to tell the story of how and why this happened, but not to do it in the usual way. There have been lots and lots of great books written about the decline of the middle class in the last generation, income inequality, political polarization, globalization and its effect on the economy. I didn't want to write a policy book. I wanted to write a narrative, a book that would feel like reading a novel, except that all of it would be true, or as true as I could make it, and it would tell the story of the past generation. Because my view is that since around the late 70s, which happens to be when I graduated from high school and left Palo Alto for good, so everything has gone to hell since I left Palo Alto, there's been a kind of undoing of the deal that used to exist between Americans, which was if you did your part and worked hard and held up your end, there would be a place for you in American life and an even better place for your children. It was the dream of upward mobility and equal opportunity. And although that dream was never true for all Americans, the circle of inclusion widened to include more and more of us, and the reality of equal opportunity was paid off, was made good. And I think in the last generation, we've seen that begin to come apart. And instead, there's a sense in which rather than institutions like the ones I named earlier supporting the aspirations of ordinary Americans, more and more people feel like they're in it on their own and have to find their own way. It's an age of entrepreneurs rather than of structures and institutions. For some people, that's been very good, and for other people, that's been destabilizing and even devastating. So to tell this story in this novelistic way, I wanted to write about the whole country in a way. It was a preposterous ambition. I think I've reached the point in my career where I just got tired of doing things in sort of the way that would be easiest for me or most successful or following in a template that had worked before. I wanted to try something completely new in my own work. And this book is a departure from everything I've written before. I wanted to tell the story of the most successful and the least. The power centers like Washington, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and also the forgotten places of the country. The celebrities, and there are portraits of everyone from Jay-Z and Newt Gingrich to Alice Waters and Elizabeth Warren in the book, and also obscure people whom you've never heard of and who are the main characters in the book. There's about 4 or 5 of them. And so this was this big, panoramic, and yet very intimate picture of the country as it's evolved in the last generation. So first I'm going to read the prologue, which will give you a sense of the ambitions of the book and the themes of the book, and then talk a little bit more about some of the characters in it. No one can say when the unwinding began, when the coil that held Americans together in its secure and sometimes stifling grip first gave way. Like any great change, the unwinding began at countless times, in countless ways. And at some moment, the country, always the same country, crossed a line of history and became irretrievably different. If you were born around 1960 or afterward, you've spent your adult life in the vertigo of that unwinding. You watched structures that had been in place before your birth collapse like pillars of salt across the vast visible landscape. The farms of the Carolina Piedmont, the factories of the Mahoning Valley, Florida subdivisions, California schools. And other things, harder to see, but no less vital in supporting the order of everyday life, changed beyond recognition. Ways and means in Washington caucus rooms, taboos on New York trading desks, manners and morals everywhere. When the norms that made the old institutions useful began to unwind and the leaders abandoned their posts, the Roosevelt Republic that had reigned for almost half a century came undone. The void was filled by the default force in American life, organized money. The unwinding is nothing new. There have been unwindings every generation or two. The fall to earth of the founders' heavenly republic in a noisy marketplace of quarrelsome factions, the war that tore the United States apart and turned them from plural to singular, the crash that laid waste to the business of America, making way for a democracy of bureaucrats and everymen. Each decline brought renewal. Each implosion released energy. Out of each unwinding came a new cohesion. The unwinding brings freedom, more than the world has ever granted, and to more kinds of people than ever before. Freedom to go away, freedom to return, freedom to change your story, get your facts, get hired, get fired, get high, marry, divorce, go broke, begin again, start a business, have it both ways, take it to the limit, walk away from the ruins, succeed beyond your dreams and boast about it, fail abjectly, and try again. And with freedom, the unwinding brings its illusions, for all these pursuits are as fragile as thought balloons popping against circumstances. Winning and losing are all American games, and in the unwinding, winners win bigger than ever, floating away like bloated dirigibles, and losers have a long way to fall before they hit bottom, and sometimes they never do. This much freedom leaves you on your own. More Americans than ever before live alone, but even a family can exist in isolation. just managing to survive in the shadow of a huge military base without a soul to lend a hand. A shiny new community can spring up overnight, miles from anywhere, then fade away just as fast. An old city can lose its industrial foundation and 2/3 of its people, while all its mainstays, churches, government, businesses, charities, unions, fall like building flats in a strong wind, hardly making a sound. Alone on a landscape, without solid structures, Americans have to improvise their own destinies, plot their own stories of success and salvation. A North Carolina boy clutching a Bible in the sunlight grows up to receive a new vision of how the countryside could be resurrected. A young man goes to Washington and spends the rest of his career trying to recall the idea that drew him there in the first place. An Ohio girl has to hold her life together as everything around her falls apart until, in middle age, she finally seizes the chance to do more than just survive. As these obscure Americans find their way in the Unwinding, they pass alongside new monuments where the old institutions once stood, the outsized lives of their most famous countrymen, celebrities who only grow more exalted as other things recede. These icons sometimes occupy the personal place of household gods, and they offer themselves as answers to the riddle of how to live a good or better life. In the Unwinding, everything changes and nothing lasts, except for the voices, American voices, open, sentimental, angry, matter-of-fact, inflected with borrowed ideas, God, TV, and the dimly remembered past, telling a joke above the noise of the assembly line, complaining behind window shades drawn against the world, thundering justice to a crowded park or an empty chamber, closing a deal on the phone, dreaming aloud late at night on a front porch as trucks rush by in the darkness. That just gave you a map of the entire book. That Ohio girl who grows up to be an assembly line worker is a woman named Tammy Thomas, a black woman in Youngstown, Ohio, who grew up while Youngstown, this great old steel city, lost its mills, lost its jobs, lost itself, really, and yet she somehow raised 3 kids on her own because she had one of the last good blue-collar jobs until it was offshored in a bankruptcy that managed to sort of gut the company while making a few people very wealthy. And she remade herself into a community organizer just in time for Obama's election. Jeff Connaughton is this Washington operative in the book who starts out as a Biden guy, becomes disillusioned with Biden, becomes a lobbyist, becomes disillusioned with lobbying, and then goes back into government to try to make Wall Street pay for the financial crisis. Doesn't quite succeed. Dean Price is the North Carolina boy who grows up in the Bible Belt. His father is a fire and brimstone preacher. It is as red America gets anywhere. He wants to be an entrepreneur, and so he opens a chain of truck stops in along Route 220 between North Carolina and Virginia, fast food, convenience stores, and finds that it's harder and harder to make it as the big box stores move in and squeeze out local businesses, and multinational oil companies and national gas chains undercut his price. And so Dean is really one of the main characters in the book. You follow these stories in the book through the course of this generation from the late 70s to the present. You move back and forth between these main characters, and I should also mention someone relevant here, Peter Thiel, who is sort of our guide to Silicon Valley in the book, and who was obviously the founder of PayPal and the first outside investor in Facebook, and a noted contrarian thinker. Tampa is a big part of the book. So the dream of a house in the exurbs, which turned into a nightmare when the housing market collapsed. You follow all their stories over the course of these 3 decades, while taking little detours into the lives of the celebrities who were sort of shaping the culture that these ordinary people were growing up in and living in and trying to make their way in. Dean Price ended up feeling that he could not make it as an independent truck stop operator and had a kind of epiphany. His whole life was like a series of epiphanies. Very religious in a somewhat unorthodox way. His life was a quest. It is a quest. And the turning point came when he realized that the answer to the problems in his area, because his area was tobacco country, textile country. It had mainstays, and they went away one by one in the 90s and early 2000s, leaving behind a kind of despoiled landscape, and all the problems of the inner city transferred to rural America. Multiple generations on public assistance, drug abuse, unemployment, out of wedlock birth. Dean decided that the answer to the decline in his corner of America was alternative energy. And he became a kind of Johnny Appleseed for biodiesel, first trying out canola seeds as the source and finally turning to waste oil from the many barbecue restaurants and other sources of oil in North Carolina. So I'm just going to finish by reading one passage that catches Dean Price just as he's making this conversion from being a failed truck stop entrepreneur to a local prophet of biodiesel. A 2-lane asphalt road ran past the woods, white oak, shagbark hickory, Carolina ash, and in the shadows of the trees, a tobacco barn was year by year collapsing on itself, the metal roof sloping inward, pieces of bare siding hanging loose from nails. Nearby, a white clapboard house with empty windows squatted at the roadside, half smothered in tree branches and vines, while a fire-scorched, handwritten sign on the outside wall still advertised crush. Farther along, the road took a turn, and a tidy brick ranch house with a big satellite dish mounted on top stood in the golden sunlight of a red-brown field. Another bend, a gentle hill, deep woods again, then an abandoned metal warehouse alone in a clearing. The road straightened and flattened and came to a stoplight where a pair of strip malls faced each other. Parking lots full, a Walgreens across from a McDonald's, Shell opposing BP. Another light, a shuttered car dealership, a vast scrapyard with a mountain of twisted metal and stacked timbers next door to a spinning mill that was being methodically gutted like a great whale and sold off one part at a time. Then downtown, the lonely little Main Street, a taekwondo studio, a government benefits office, a closed restaurant, a nameless corner store for rent, 2 pedestrians in 4 blocks, a Dollar General that marked the far end of town. On the other side, the country opened up at once, the road passing fields, corn planted on one, nothing on the next, weeds and clods of dirt, then a residential development with 2-story, look-alike houses in neat rows laid out across someone's former tobacco farm. And beyond the subdivision, isolated on acres of grass behind a split-rail fence and a man-made lake, the supersized faux chateau of a celebrity NASCAR driver. The landscape Dean had returned to, where he planned to live out his life, was very old and also new, as particular as anything in America, and also as generic, as beautiful and as ugly. In his imagination, it had become a nightmare, so profoundly wrong that he called it sinful, and he hated the sin more than any casual visitor or distant critic possibly could. Yet he also saw here a dream of redemption, so unlikely and glorious that it could only fill the mind's eye of a visionary native son. Once driving through Cleveland County, Dean happened to pass the Hard-Shell Baptist Church that his father had once tried to get but failed, the failure that had broken his father's will. Dean had gone down with his father to Cleveland County and heard the sermon that he had given for his audition back around 1975, so that decades later he recognized the church. And he also noticed that there was now a fucking Bojangles right next door. For Dean, Bojangles had come to represent everything that was wrong with the way Americans lived, how they raised their food and transported it across the country, how they grew the crops to feed the animals they ate, the way they employed the people who worked in the restaurants, the way the money left the community. Everything about it was wrong. Dean's own business, gas and fast food, had become hateful to him, and he saw the error of his ways as his father never had, and the conjunction of his father's legacy and his own struck him with bitter irony as he drove past. He was seeing beyond the surfaces of the land to its hidden truths. Some nights he sat up late on his front porch with a glass of Jack and listened to the trucks heading south on 220, carrying crates of live chickens to the slaughterhouses, always under cover of darkness, like a vast and shameful trafficking. Chickens pumped full of hormones that left them too big to walk. And he thought how these same chickens might return from their destination as pieces of meat to the floodlit Bojangles up the hill from his house. And that meat would be drowned in the bubbling fryers by employees whose hatred of the job would leak into the cooked food. And that food would be served up and eaten by customers who would grow obese and end up in the hospital in Greensboro with diabetes or heart failure, a burden to the public. And later, Dean would see them riding around the Mayadan Walmart in electric carts because they were too heavy to walk the aisles of a supercenter, just like hormone-fed chickens. So that's Dean Price's vision, and it's a dark one, but it contains these seeds of renewal, which he is, as we speak, out there pursuing and selling every day. And although there's a dark edge to this vision of America in my book, when I think about Washington or Wall Street or corporate America, I get depressed. But when I'm with someone like Dean or Tammy Thomas or the other characters, I feel more hopeful because they have this resilience and this resourcefulness that I think may not be uniquely American, but that you find everywhere in this country, in the most out-of-the-way places where the media never goes and no one's paying attention. And I wanted to bring those stories to light, as well as to describe the larger darkness in which they're unfolding. And that's what The Unwinding is about. And if you have any questions on your lunch hour here, I would be very happy to hear them. Yes. Wait for the mic.
So I think you anticipated my question with your closing, but I'm just curious, like, how much of a tragic story you think this is? Because when I hear you describe this, what really comes across, the main threads would be class, wealth, power, morality. And I think back to the stories my grandmother told me growing up in the Depression. And frankly, some of the tragedy and some of the gross injustice that we hear about today pales in comparison to those stories. So I'm curious how you think this compares to historical precedents.
Right. It's a good question. I'm really glad to talk about history because we don't talk about it enough in this country. Americans were much poorer then. Life was harder. There was no air conditioning. Imagine being Dean Price in North Carolina and having no air conditioning, which transformed the South. The food may have been locally produced, but there probably wasn't enough of it, which is a different problem from eating at Bojangles. Emaciation may have been more the problem than obesity. A lot of people didn't even go to school, let alone go to bad schools. So no one should say, this is as bad as the worst. What I feel is that we have taken a big step back toward that by undoing the structures that were put in place in the Depression and afterward in the post-war period, which supported middle-class aspirations, which gave some help and sort of channeled the ambitions of ordinary people. Those structures have begun to fold, as I've described in the book. And although it's created this tremendous opportunity and freedom for people with the ability, the talent, and the luck to take advantage, it's also left countless Americans behind, which is something that we can forget here in the Bay Area, which is one of the very few parts of the country that has really done well over the last generation. So my feeling is we don't need to look to the Great Depression for comparisons. I'm worried about the direction we're going in. And it seems to me that, if you've seen The Great Gatsby, or if you've better yet read the novel, which I would recommend over the movie any day, we're getting closer to that America, where life is lived through the people at the top and through the celebrities and their stories. And ordinary people no longer see themselves rising with the top of society. It's more like the top has risen from the rest of the country. And the worship of celebrity is one symptom of the failure of institutions. As I wrote in the prologue, celebrities are taking the place of institutions. Tech billionaires are funding school systems. TV hostesses are floating the publishing industry. And I worry that when these core institutions are personalized that way and depend so much on the private whims and ideals of the most successful, they're very vulnerable.
I was just wondering, did you learn anything from any of your characters that you weren't expecting to learn, or did you come in trying to tell a narrative that you had already had an opinion towards, and then just pick and choose from what they told you to help you tell that narrative?
Right, so I'll tell you a little about my method. It's the method of total immersion, so that I would run across someone like Dean Price. I'm working on another New Yorker story, and 30 seconds after hearing him talk on the phone about biodiesel, I knew that I needed to get to know this guy, because he had both this passion and articulateness, but also, admittedly, kind of a salesman's brilliance in conveying his vision. I went down to North Carolina, lived in his house maybe half a dozen or 8 times, met his family, hung out with him, traveled around the back roads of North Carolina in his beat-up Honda while he went from county to county trying to get local schools to buy into the idea of using biodiesel for school buses. And there's no way I could have had an opinion about any of that before I went, because I didn't know any of it. It was all discovery. Admittedly, I was looking for stories of Americans who were in some way struggling to both to remake themselves and to come up with a new vision of their own part of the country. I was interested in people who were rooted in one place and were still focused on that place, rather than had some giant idea that applied everywhere and nowhere. And it wasn't always easy to find them, but once you do, you really get out of the way, because they're so much more interesting than whatever preconceived ideas I or you could have about them. And the other point about the method is there's no first person anywhere in this book. The word I coming from me does not appear, which is a complete departure from my earlier work and was a really important decision. And I think it had the great benefit of giving you the feeling that you're watching a movie and you don't want to be distracted from that movie. If I were to start saying something about these characters in my own voice, it'd be like the guy next to you talking in the middle of the film. You'd want to shut me up. So there's more of a sense, I think, of discovery and of the characters and their language. You can kind of hear in that Dean Price passage, these are not really my words so much as his. The word sinful is not a word I would have used about Bojangles. That's Dean Price. Yes?
You were mentioning how the Unwinding is sort of setting us back to a time when these icons were sort of leading us. And one of the things that interested me in coming here is just the fact that you work at the New Yorker, and I find that sometimes the New Yorker and a few other publications are the ones that present these sort of reality news stories. I was wondering, back in the day when the icons were leading, they were the newspaper owners. They were giving us, or people who lived then, the news. So I was wondering, from your perspective, how much of that is happening today again? Is there a return to where the wealthy, the icons, are determining what information is being delivered, and even, I mean, maybe even at the New Yorker, I don't know.
I'd say 2 things are happening at once. It's a really good question. On the one hand, there's this tremendous diffusion of information, which maybe your company, as much as any other force in our society, is responsible for, so that more people have more access to more information than at any time in human history. It's the most radical change in how we think and interact with information in maybe ever. And I think that is partly a good thing, because it has given people who used to not have any access to it a lot of access. Google is laying fiber optic cable in towns around the country that don't have it. It has also done what my book describes. It has broken up and sort of fragmented the idea that there's a common world we live in and a common set of facts. You know, when I had that long list of what you're now free to do, you're free to get your own facts. Everyone has their own facts and their own websites and Twitter feeds that reinforce those facts. And although that seems empowering, it also, and liberating, it also has the negative effect of fracturing us so that there's no place where we can all meet and have an argument. The way Time Magazine and the CBS Evening News used to kind of command the belief of enough people that there was a world in which everyone agreed they were living in. Your question about money and the news is really well taken. I don't know if you read that David Koch of the Koch brothers, the oil fortune, is perhaps going to buy Times Mirror Company, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and countless other newspapers, radio stations, TV stations. Some of this was made possible by a law, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which took the lid off how many news outlets one company could own, and that inevitably led to consolidation. So we have this, Google-driven dispersion, and then this concentrated wealth-driven consolidation. And I'm not sure, if there's going to be a winner in that, but I do think that there was a period when corporations owned news organizations but did not use them in the same way that David Koch will use the LA Times if he gets it. Fortunately, the New Yorker, although it's owned by a family, is owned by a family that doesn't seem to want to tell the New Yorker what to write. And that's, I think, a good thing because I like what I read in the New Yorker and I want it to continue. I want to continue to have a job. None of us can ever be sure of that in this world, but it's a very confused and tumultuous period in the news. And there's a reporter in my book from the St. Petersburg Times who kind of represents, he's just an old-fashioned shoe leather reporter in the age of Facebook and Twitter, where his whole job may no longer be necessary in the eyes of his readers, and he's still trying to do what reporters have always done.
So you seem to be referring to this ethos that held the country together pre-1970s, which I think most of us recognize as, that was often a Judeo-Christian, waspy, rather bigoted ethos. And when we liberated more and more groups to have their voice heard or what have you, right. I think, some would call that action itself a tipping point, but that was more indicative of as you got more freedoms, as we all got more freedoms, we now have greater responsibilities, and there are more people at the table, and it's easier to be anonymous and making decisions. So do we need a return to that ethos? Do we need a new ethos? And who gets to decide that? I mean, how does this country move towards cohesion again after this massive fracturing? That's
a great question. I think what you're pointing to is the fact that two seemingly contradictory things have been happening over the course of the period in the Unwinding. One, greater and greater social equality. More and more groups admitted into the circle of opportunity, power, a place near the top. Oprah gave the Harvard commencement address last week. Gay boys have just been allowed to become Boy Scouts. And no one would want to go back to 1960 if that's what we would get. I would say that period had in its own structures the tools of self-correction. The civil rights period is a great example of that. Within the institutions of Congress, the media, and social movements, there was the ability to correct this gross historical injustice. I don't know that we have the tools to correct what's happened alongside this widening inclusiveness, which is widening disparities. More and more people can get to the top, but more and more people are never going to get to the top because we're becoming more stratified. And where you're born is more and more where you're going to end up, which is, to me, such a threat to a basic conviction of Americans and our democracy, which is equal opportunity. I mean, if there is a bedrock value alongside freedom. It's equality of opportunity. I think anyone who looks at the way the country is going today has to admit that that is less and less real. So who gets to decide, how we fix that? I mean, you do. We all do. All I want to do was hold up a mirror and say, read this and get a feeling for what it's like to be in America today and for the years that have kind of preceded this moment and led to it. And I'm not going to tell you, here are the 10 policy prescriptions. You will not find an epilogue that gives you, let's get rid of the carried interest exemption for hedge fund managers, although I think we should. It's not that kind of book. I hope it reaches you on a deeper level and tells you more like this is what it feels like to be alive and in America at this moment. And maybe that can give readers a more useful way of thinking about your question, who gets to decide and how do we find some new cohesion than another policy prescription book would give you.
Do you think people would have had a harder time either empathizing or not really empathizing, but awareness, right? Because you're trying to find a bunch of different people with very different backgrounds, different places in the country that are in many ways very isolated from each other, that would never run into each other, that are very different experiences. Do you think in terms of people's ability to even comprehend that those worlds exist in our country, do you think that is lesser or greater now than it would have been in like what time period you're pointing to 25 years ago, 50 years ago?
I love that question. First of all, it makes me think, 2 weeks ago, Dean Price and Tammy Thomas were both staying in my house. They actually met to go to a party for the book in New York, and it was one of the weirdest. You can imagine the contents of my head was staying in my house and talking to each other. It was really crazy and really fun. But your question is more serious than that, and I think it is harder for Americans to know how other Americans live than it used to be. Even though we have all kinds of tools, YouTube, et cetera, to see it from every part of the country, I found when I was researching this book, going from Brooklyn to Stokesdale, North Carolina, felt in some ways like a longer trip than going from Brooklyn to Rangoon, Burma, which I did in 2008, or Baghdad even. Partly because we are in the same country, we have these common reference points, and yet we're living such different lives. What we eat is different, the way we talk is different, the way we think. Not to say homogenization and the suburbanization of life after the war was such a wonderful thing, but you look back and kind of feel a little nostalgic for an America where everyone went to public school, and the quality of public schools was actually not wildly different unless you were in a really, really poor place or a really, really rich place. I went to high school in Palo Alto in the 70s, right before Proposition 13 began the gutting of the tax base for education in California. Everybody I knew went to public school except the screw-ups who got sent to a private school. Now I know that private schools have become a major avenue for the new elite of the Bay Area, and I can't help feeling that we're losing something, that our lives are... Sorry? I know, everywhere. I feel like here the schools were so good and were so egalitarian in a way that to me it's like a model that has been lost right here in our own neck of the woods. But I do think we're divided and separate in so many different ways. And it's just a shock when you leave one of the more successful parts of the country to one of the less.
Two things. First, I think the collapse of the textile industry is one of the untold stories. My wife is from Cleveland County, North Carolina, and so thank you for telling that.
It's a big part of Dean Price's life because that was the job that was waiting for you out of high school. Right.
And all those plants are just, they're empty, closed. I mean, you've been there and seen it. But I was wondering, as you're riding around with Dean Price or other people, and he's talking to people, do any of them say, "Who's this guy? And what's he doing? What are you doing? What are you doing with that pad?
Hell yes. Hell yes.
What are you doing with that tape recorder?"
I had to explain it every time. Fortunately, most people, especially in small towns and rural America, are less suspicious of journalists than the White House, Facebook, and Goldman Sachs. So rather than having to set a whole bunch of ground rules and then run quotes by them for their approval, which is what reporters routinely do now, and it's actually quite a corrupt system where the source gets to rewrite the quote as per the original ground rules, but that's like the power that institutions we want to cover have. If you're a decent person and are truly interested, not just pretending, because they'll pick that up, if you're truly interested and have some empathy, I have always found, whether it's in, Surrey County, North Carolina, or Kirkuk, Iraq, people want to tell their story. And it's only when they're in a sort of quasi-official position that they get nervous that it's going to come back to bite them. Most of the people Dean was talking to were like tobacco farmers, former textile or furniture workers. They were okay with it. And so far I haven't heard anyone telling me that I destroyed their life, and I hope I haven't.
So clearly you wrote the book from a very U.S.-centric, you're telling a story about the United States, but I'm curious if there were any problems or themes that you think could be applied at a more global scale. Probably like things that you've seen in your travels or solutions that you thought might be applied globally.
You're getting at, perhaps a weakness in the book, which is it is so much about the U.S., and my literary model was John Dos Passos' trilogy USA, which is about the first decades of the 20th century, a trilogy of novels that, the Iraq War has a little place in my book, but I'd already written a book about the Iraq War. Do I need to do that again? Iran-Contra is mentioned. It's like you're seeing the world and the big events of history out of your peripheral vision while you're living through the lives of these characters. And I guess I'd say I learned how insular Americans are. My characters were not talking about the wars very much. They weren't talking about globalization and India and China. They were talking about what was happening in their neighborhood, and that it may be a human trait, but I think it's also an American trait. We're so big and surrounded by oceans, and there's so much going on here, and we're so obsessed with ourselves that honestly, the rest of the world kind of disappeared during these conversations I had. And so in being true to the point of view of my characters, I let the world sort of slip away. I think the best point of comparison is Europe, where there have been unwindings across the continent, especially since the financial crisis, but where a country like Germany has somehow decided to hold on to certain institutional constraints that keep society from completely fracturing. So that after the financial crisis and the recession, they had these job share plans where people worked fewer days, but more people got to work. And that was a decision the German government made in order to make sure unemployment didn't get out of control. That's just one of many policy decisions that tell you globalization is not the only cause of these things. There are also decisions made by governments and by businesses that drive the forces that are causing this falling apart. And Germany is a very good counterexample to the path that we've taken. But it's not in the book. The book is very much, as you can see, about our country. And one more question here.
So you talked a bit about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs benefiting from this. Can you talk a bit about how you feel, if any, Silicon Valley has contributed to the unwinding at all?
That's a great question. You might have heard that I wrote an article in the New Yorker a couple weeks ago that's kind of about how Silicon Valley is getting more involved in politics and what's driving that. My feeling about Silicon Valley is it's good, but it's not enough. It's done great things for a lot of individuals, but in the grand scheme of things, the employment level is so small compared to General Motors. Twitter, which dominates my world of media, has like 900 employees here in San Francisco. Google is far bigger, and not to curry any favor here, but I think Google may be the one of the new tech companies that sort of is looking more like the economy that has been replaced. I don't think social networking, I'm a skeptic. I don't think it's going to drive middle-class standards of living up. I think what it does is gives us lots and lots of wonderful tools and massive distraction, even addiction. I know that from my own life. This thing owns me. And it may be that I walk around the streets here and everyone is staring at their phone. It's kind of like a picture of the unwinding, like no one is talking to each other, no one is looking at each other. I think virtual technology has sort of created conditions where we are more divided from each other in life, and maybe we're connected in all kinds of ways as well. It's just, Peter Thiel is in my book because he's one big figure out here, a libertarian, not my politics at all, but he's a critic of the boosterism of the information age. He says it just hasn't raised living standards across the country. In fact, it's coincided with the hollowing out of the middle class. It's a very hard thing to explain. How is it that this revolution that has changed life and the way Americans and people around the world live has not changed or improved the fortunes of the broad middle class in America the way the automobile age did? And that's something, I don't have an answer, but it may be something that you all will want to think about and talk to each other about, because to me it's very much a question for Silicon Valley. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate you taking the time. And